The stagecoach came screaming into Harrow Flats on a Tuesday morning in late February of 1883, its wheels half frozen and its horses blowing steam into the bitter Colorado air like smoke from a blacksmith's forge. And the only passenger who stepped down without shaking was a young woman who looked at the wind-scoured town as though she had already decided it would do. Her name was Celia Wallace, and she had exactly $3.42 in the pocket of her wool coat, a leather satchel worn soft at the handles, and a reputation she had left behind in Denver like a snake sheds its skin, deliberately, and without a backward glance. She was 24 years old, lean-faced and dark-eyed with hair the color of strong coffee that she kept pinned beneath a felt hat that had seen better seasons. The townspeople who watched her from behind frost-clouded windows saw a woman who moved with the quiet economy of someone accustomed to doing everything herself, and they drew their own conclusions, most of which were wrong. Harrow Flats sat in a valley between two ridges of the San Juan Mountains, a place that the railroad had missed by 11 miles and was beginning to resent it. There was a general store run by a man named Holt, a saloon called the Dusty Nickel, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a livery stable, and a telegraph office that only worked about half the time, which the telegraph operator insisted was better than nothing. The surrounding land was ranch country, hard red earth and wide sky, and in February that sky was the particular shade of gray that promised more snow before it promised anything else. Celia stood at the edge of the porch outside the stagecoach depot, which was really just a converted barn with a bench and a sign, and she studied the town with those steady dark eyes of hers. She needed work. She needed it today, not tomorrow, because $3.42 would buy her perhaps 2 nights in whatever passed for a boarding house in Harrow Flats, and after that she would be sleeping in the cold, and the cold in late February in the mountains was not a thing to sleep in. She had heard about the valley from a woman on the coach out of Pueblo, a talkative rancher's wife named Mrs. Adler, who had said, somewhat grimly, that the cattle ranches around Harrow Flats were struggling with something awful this winter, and that any person who knew anything useful about livestock would find themselves employed before sundown. Celia had filed this information away the way she filed all useful information, quietly, carefully, with no outward sign of how much it mattered. What Celia Wallace knew about livestock was not a small thing. She had grown up on her father's cattle operation in the Kansas plains, and before her father's death 3 years prior she had learned from him, and from every book and almanac, she could get her hands on that cattle medicine was as much art as science, and that most ranchers were killing their herds with ignorance as often as with weather or disease. Her father had called her his best student. The veterinarian in Wichita who had occasionally consulted with her father had told her she had a gift. She had spent the years since her father's death applying that gift wherever she could find people willing to accept help from a woman, which was not always easy and not always possible. She picked up her satchel, settled her hat more firmly against the wind, and walked toward the general store because general stores always knew everything. The bell above Holt's door announced her arrival with a cheerful jangle that seemed at odds with the cold outside. The store smelled of tobacco and dried herbs, and the particular dusty warmth of a potbelly stove working hard. A man behind the counter, heavyset, middle-aged, with a gray mustache that made him look like a skeptical walrus, looked up from his ledger. "Morning," Celia said, setting her satchel down on the floor with the ease of someone who has no interest in pretending it is not heavy. "My name is Celia Wallace. I just arrived on the stage. I am looking for work on a cattle ranch, specifically any ranch that is currently having trouble with its herd." The man, who was indeed named Holt, studied her the way people in small towns study strangers, comprehensively and without much attempt to hide it. "You know cattle work," he said, and the question was not quite skeptical and not quite polite. It lived somewhere in between. "I know cattle medicine," Celia said. I grew up on a ranch in Kansas. My father ran 200 head before he died. I know blackleg and bloat, Texas fever and foot rot, and about a dozen other things that can take a herd down if you don't catch it right." She paused. "I also know how to assist in a difficult calving, which is more useful than it sounds this time of year." Holt's mustache twitched. "You know Paul Rhodes?" he asked. "I don't know anyone in this valley," she said. "I told you I just arrived." "Paul Rhodes runs the Crimson Bluff Ranch, about 4 miles east of here," Holt said, and now his voice had lost some of its careful neutrality and picked up something that sounded, to Celia's ear, like genuine concern. "He's been having a terrible time of it this winter. Lost 8 head last month to something his ranch hand couldn't identify. Word is he might lose more. He's been waiting on a veterinarian from Durango who got snowed in at the pass 3 weeks ago and still hasn't made it through." "What are the symptoms?" Celia asked immediately. Holt blinked. "I'm sorry. Of the cattle he lost, what were they showing before they died?" The store owner scratched the back of his neck. "I don't rightly know. You'd have to ask Paul himself. He comes in every Friday for supplies, but that's still 3 days away." "I cannot wait 3 days," Celia said simply. "Can you tell me how to get to Crimson Bluff Ranch?" There was a pause while Holt appeared to weigh several things simultaneously. The look of solid competence in this woman's eyes, the fact that Paul Rhodes was a good man who was losing cattle he could not afford to lose, and perhaps some more personal calculation about the nature of Providence and its tendency to arrive on stagecoaches. "Head east on the main road," he said finally. "When you see the big cottonwood that got struck by lightning, it's still standing, just split down the middle, you turn north. Follow the fence line for about 2 miles. You'll see the house and the barn." "Thank you," Celia said. "Is there a horse I can hire from the livery?" "Old Denny at the livery will set you up. Tell him I sent you. He won't cheat you if I sent you." Celia picked up her satchel. "I appreciate that," she said, and she meant it. She was out the door before Holt had fully processed what had just happened, but he found himself hoping, for Paul Rhodes's sake, that the young woman knew what she claimed to know. She did. The horse Denny gave her was a sturdy bay mare named Pepper who seemed unbothered by the cold, and Celia rode east through a landscape that was stripped bare and gray and beautiful in the severe way of things that make no attempt to be anything other than what they are. The snow was compacted along the road, but the fields on either side showed it fresh and undisturbed, and the mountains rose on both sides with the kind of authority that makes human concerns feel appropriately small. She found the split cottonwood and turned north, and she found the fence line and followed it, and after 2 miles she saw the ranch. Crimson Bluff Ranch earned its name from the red sandstone ridge that formed its northern backdrop, a wall of layered rock that caught the winter light and glowed a deep burnt orange even in the gray of February. The house was a solid 2-story structure built of timber and stone, practical and unpretentious, with a covered porch facing south. The barn was large and well-maintained, which told her something about the man who owned it. 3 ranch hands were visible near the corral, and one of them was just standing, which in cold weather on a working ranch usually meant something was wrong. As she rode into the yard, a man came out of the barn. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark blonde hair and 3 days of beard that the cold had reddened slightly at the jaw. He was perhaps 28 or 29, she thought. His face had the particular quality of someone who has been working outdoors in hard weather for years, not worn out but weather-seasoned, the lines around his eyes belonging to squinting into sun and wind rather than age. He wore a heavy canvas coat and his hat was pulled low, and when he saw her ride into his yard, he stopped walking and watched her approach with an expression that was cautious but not unwelcoming. "Can I help you?" he called. Celia brought the mare to a stop and looked at him squarely. "My name is Celia Wallace," she said. "I came in on this morning's stage. Mr. Holt in town told me you've been losing cattle to something you can't identify. I know cattle medicine. I would like to look at your herd." Paul Rhodes stood very still for a moment. The wind moved through the yard and scattered some dry snow from the fence posts. "You're a cattle doctor," he said, and the question was not dismissive, exactly, but it carried the weight of a man trying to orient himself to something unexpected. "I'm not a licensed veterinarian," Celia said, because she had learned long ago that honesty about the limits of her credentials served her better than pretense. "But I've been working with cattle since I was 12 years old, and I've seen and treated most of what can go wrong with them. The veterinarian you're waiting for from Durango is Dr. Marcus Webb, I'd guess, because he's the nearest one, and if he's snowed in at the pass, he won't be through for another week at minimum." "Your cattle may not have that week." Something shifted in Paul Rhodes's face. He took a few steps toward her. "How do you know about Webb?" "I don't know him specifically," she said. "I know the situation because Mr. Holt told me you'd been waiting 3 weeks. That means the pass closed before your man got through, which means he was coming from a distance, and Webb is the nearest cattle veterinarian to this county." She paused. "I may be wrong about the name. It doesn't change what I know." Paul looked at her for another long moment, and she could see him calculating, the desperation of a man who has been watching his livelihood die by degrees against the instinct to be cautious about a stranger who rode in unannounced on a February morning. She had seen this calculation before. She waited without fidgeting, which was something her father had taught her. Let the silence work. "His name is Webb," Paul said at last, "and I've lost 9 head now, not 8. Come down off that horse, Miss Wallace. I'll show you what we're dealing with." She dismounted and tied the mare to the hitching post and followed him into the barn. The barn was warm with the presence of animals and smelled of hay and manure, and the sharp tang of something medicinal, carbolic acid, she thought, which told her that Paul or his hands had already been trying to treat something. She counted the cattle in her quick rancher's sweep, perhaps 60 head in the barn, another 30 or so in the adjacent covered pen. They were a mixed Hereford and Shorthorn operation, well-fed and decently kept considering the season, but she saw the problem within the first 2 minutes. In the far corner of the barn, a group of 8 or 10 cattle had been separated from the others. 3 of them were showing the telltale signs immediately. The muscle tremors, the particular way they were holding themselves with their hindquarters tucked, and the way their eyes moved restless, pain-bright. One of them had the slight blue discoloration at the gums that was the signature of what she suspected. She walked straight to the separated group, crouched down, and began examining without asking permission, because time was its own kind of permission. Paul followed her. Behind him, a ranch hand appeared in the barn doorway, a younger man, maybe 20, with a worried look on his face. "That's Jimmy," Paul said quietly. "He's been tending them." "Good morning, Jimmy," Celia said, without looking up from the nearest animal. "Has the water source for this group been changed in the last month?" Jimmy blinked. "We moved them off the lower pasture creek in December when it froze over," he said. "They've been on the trough water since. And the trough is at the stone trough on the eastern side of the barn." "Yes, ma'am." "Paul," Celia said, turning to look up at him from her crouch, "do you have copper pipes or brass fittings on the water line to that trough?" He stared at her. "We replaced the fittings last November," he said slowly, "after the freeze cracked the old iron joints." "Used brass because that's what Holt had in stock," Celia nodded. "That is your problem," she said. "Brass fittings can leach copper into standing water, particularly when the water is cold and slightly acidic from runoff, which it would be in late winter. Your cattle have copper toxicity. It accumulates slowly, which is why it took several weeks before you started seeing deaths. The liver fails to process the excess copper, and then you get a hemolytic crisis." She stood up. "The cattle that have already died likely reached a point of no return. These ones showing symptoms are in various stages. Some of them I may be able to help." Paul Rhodes stood very still. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, not the skepticism of someone who disbelieves, but the particular stunned quality of a person who has just been given an answer they had almost stopped hoping would come. "What do we do?" he asked. "First, you change the water source for this entire group today," she said. "Not just these sick ones, all of them. Fill troughs with clean well water only, no pipe water until those fittings are out. Second, I need ammonium molybdate if you have it. Or if not, high sulfate feed can help bind the copper, but ammonium molybdate works better. Third, for the ones already in crisis, I need to keep them calm, supported, and I'll need to give them a reducing agent. Do you have any sodium thiosulfate on the property? I have sulfur compounds in the medicine cabinet, Paul said, moving toward the far wall where a wooden cabinet hung, from when we treated for mange last spring. Show me what you have. He opened the cabinet and she went through it with practiced efficiency, her gloved fingers moving among the bottles and packets with the confidence of someone reading a familiar language. She found what she needed, not everything, but enough to begin. I'll need to go back to Holt's store, she said. There are a few things I need that you don't have, but I can start with 3 of these cattle right now. Jimmy, Paul said, and his voice had changed. It was still calm, but it carried a new current underneath, the tone of a man who has made a decision and is moving with it. Get the water changed on the east trough, use the well pump, and move the cattle from pen 3 to pen 5 away from any brass fittings. Do it now. Yes, sir, Jimmy said, already moving. Paul turned back to Celia. What do you need me to do? She looked at him for a beat, this tall, weather-faced rancher who had just decided, in the span of 5 minutes, to trust a stranger who arrived from nowhere with a knowledge he desperately needed. There was something straightforward about him that she appreciated, no wounded pride, no argument, just the practical intelligence of a man who recognized competence when he saw it and was smart enough to follow it. I need you to hold this animal steady, she said. She's frightened and she's in pain and she needs to be calm for this to work. Can you do that? I can do that, Paul Rhodes said, and he put his hands on the animal's neck with a firmness that was also somehow a gentleness, and Celia began to work. The next 4 hours passed in the focused, urgent rhythm that she had always found to be the best part of what she did, the complete absorption of difficult skilled work, the conversation between knowledge and the immediate problem, the satisfaction of doing something that mattered with full attention. She moved through the sick animals methodically, treating the ones she assessed as recoverable, and making the hard judgment calls about the ones who were too far progressed. She sent Paul to Holt's store with a written list of what she needed, and when he came back with it, she continued working. 2 of the hands helped as she directed them, and she noted that they followed her instructions without the usual sideways looks she got in other places from men who were not accustomed to taking direction from a woman. She suspected this said something about Paul Rhodes as an employer. By midday, she had done everything she could do for now. She walked out of the barn into the cold afternoon air and leaned against the fence post and breathed, and she became aware for the first time since she'd arrived that she was hungry and cold, and tired from the stagecoach journey that had preceded all of this. She had been riding and working for 6 hours, and she had not eaten since a piece of cornbread she'd had at the last stage stop the previous evening. Paul Rhodes came to stand beside her. He had been helping for most of the 4 hours, not hovering or getting in the way but being exactly where he was needed, and she had found this quality in him, this capacity to be useful without requiring instruction, to be notable. 5 of those 8 are going to be all right, I think, she said. The other 3, I don't want to give you false hope. We'll know more by tomorrow morning. And the rest of the herd, change the water source, like I said, and they should be fine. Copper toxicity doesn't spread between animals, it's an environmental problem. Once you remove the source, the healthy ones stay healthy. She paused. You should have a blacksmith in and replace all the brass fittings with iron before next winter. I can write down what to specify. I'd be grateful, Paul said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the red ridge behind the ranch. The light was getting its late winter low angle and it set the sandstone blazing. Miss Wallace, he said, where are you staying tonight? She looked at him. I was planning to go back to town and see about a room. That's 4 miles in weather that's about to get worse, he said. He pointed southwest, where the sky was taking on the particular purplish density that even she recognized as the herald of approaching snow. I have a spare room in the house. My housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, is here. She lives on the property. It would be entirely proper. And frankly, I would be grateful if you stayed through tomorrow morning to see how those 3 animals do." Celia considered this. She had been in enough frontier situations to know that the practical often overrode the conventional, and that the offer was made with a straightforwardness that had nothing in it to be suspicious of. "All right," she said. "Thank you." Mrs. Fenwick turned out to be a stout, sharp-eyed woman of about 55 who had the quality of a person who had dealt with everything the frontier could throw at a person, and had emerged slightly unimpressed by all of it. She gave Celia a look that was thorough and searching when Paul made the introductions, and then she nodded as if she'd made up her mind about something, and said the room was ready. They ate supper in the kitchen because it was warmer than the dining room, and Paul explained over a meal of beef stew and biscuits that he had owned the Crimson Bluff Ranch for 4 years, having bought it from an older rancher who had decided the winters were no longer worth it. He was 29, she learned, born in Ohio and come west at the age of 19, because Ohio had seemed to him, in those years, like a life that had already been decided, and he had not wanted a life that was already decided. "What made you come to Colorado specifically?" she asked. "I worked cattle drives up from Texas in my early 20s, he said. "I came through this valley in 1877 and I never entirely stopped thinking about it. The ridge, mostly. I kept thinking about that red ridge." She understood this. There were places that announced themselves to a certain kind of person. "What about you?" he asked. "You said you came from Denver." "I was in Denver for about 6 months, she said. "Before that I was in Pueblo, and before that Santa Fe. I go where there's work for what I know how to do." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but she could hear how it sounded itinerant, rootless. She had been these things for 3 years. It was not a life she had chosen so much as a life that had formed around the circumstances of her father's death and the absence of any other clear path. "Is there family somewhere?" he asked, with a care that told her the question was not idle curiosity. "No," she said simply. "There was my father and there was the ranch, and when he died the bank took both. I have an aunt in Missouri who I exchange letters with occasionally." She lifted her eyes from her bowl to look at him, and found him watching her with an expression that was not pity. She would have disliked pity, but something more like recognition, as though this particular kind of solitary self-sufficiency was familiar to him from the inside. "I'm sorry," he said, "about your father. He died doing what he loved," she said. "A horse threw him. He wouldn't have wanted it to be anything more complicated than that." She paused. "He would have liked your ranch. The soil here is good underneath the clay. You could do more with it if you had more hands." Paul smiled, actually smiled, which changed his face considerably, the weathering cracking into something younger and more open. "Is that a way of saying you've been assessing my operation?" "I assess every operation I come to," she said. "It's how I find what's wrong with it." She said it without apology, and he laughed, which surprised her pleasantly. He had a good laugh, uncalculating and genuine. "I'm not offended," he said. "What else have you assessed? Your barn is well built and you have good hay reserves. Your cattle are in decent condition for this point in winter, which means you fed them properly in autumn instead of letting the pasture go to seed and hoping for the best, the way a lot of operations do. Your fences are maintained. Your hands seem loyal." She paused. "You replaced the wrong kind of pipe fitting in November, but you couldn't have known that would be a problem without specific knowledge. Everything else you've done right." He was watching her with the kind of full attention that made her slightly aware of her own face, which was an unfamiliar sensation. In her life since her father's death she had been looked at many ways, skeptically, dismissively, occasionally with discomfort by men who did not know how to categorize her, but not often with this particular quality of focused, genuine regard. "Miss Wallace," he said, "what would you charge for another week?" She blinked. "Another week. The cattle need to be monitored through the recovery. I need someone who knows what to watch for and what to do if something goes wrong. Webb still won't be through the pass for another week at least." He held her gaze. "And frankly, I'd rather know that you're the one watching them." She thought about the $3.42 in her pocket. She thought about the boarding house in town. She thought about the February sky and what was probably under it, 3 weeks hence if she kept moving. Room and board and $1.50 a day, she said, because she knew her worth. Done, Paul Rhodes said, without hesitation, and held out his hand. She shook it. His hand was large and calloused and warm from the stove, and the handshake was firm without being performative, the kind that seals a practical agreement between practical people. She told herself this was exactly what it was. She was in the barn before first light the next morning. 2 of the 3 severely ill cattle had made it through the night. The third had not, and she had been sitting with it when it went, which was something she always did. She had learned from her father that if you are responsible for an animal, you see it through to the end, whatever that end is. Paul found her there at 5:30 in the morning, sitting on a hay bale in the lamplight, and he did not make any comment about the hour or the company she was keeping. He sat down on the opposite hay bale and they were quiet together for a while, and then he said, "You all right?" "I'm always like this when I lose one," she said. "It passes." "I know the feeling," he said. They sat in the barn while the wind moved against the walls outside and the other cattle breathed in their stalls. And eventually the mood lifted the way it always did, replaced by the practical necessities of mourning on a working ranch. And Celia went to check on the recovering animals and found them improved, and this helped considerably. Over the days that followed, a rhythm established itself that was comfortable in the way of things that fit naturally together. Celia worked the herd in the mornings, checking each animal, tracking the recovery of the sick ones, instructing the hands in what to watch for. In the afternoons, she would consult with Paul about longer-term herd management, the rotation of pastures, the mineral supplementation, the signs of illness that were often dismissed as minor until they weren't. She had expected to encounter resistance from a man who had been running his own operation for 4 years, but Paul Rhodes did not have the vanity of a man protecting a position. He listened carefully, asked good questions, pushed back when he had reason to, and acknowledged when she knew something he didn't. This combination was rarer than she had come to expect, and she found herself valuing it in a way that went somewhat beyond the professional. He began coming to find her in the evenings, not always with a specific purpose. He would bring coffee to wherever she was working on her notes, or appear in the doorway of the room she used as an informal office. It had been a storage room before Mrs. Fenwick cleared it out, and lean in the doorframe and ask about whatever was on his mind. These conversations wandered. They talked about Kansas and Ohio and what the country between the two looked like. They talked about ranching and about cattle breeds and about the particular challenges of the Colorado altitude. They talked about books. She had been surprised to find him a reader, and he was surprised to find that she had carried 3 books in her worn satchel all the way from Denver, including an agricultural almanac, a collection of Oliver Wendell Holmes' essays, and a battered Spanish dictionary she was working through because she thought it useful. "Where did you learn the cattle medicine?" he asked one evening when the snow outside was heavy and Mrs. Fenwick had gone to bed and they were alone by the kitchen fire with the remnants of coffee. "My father started it," she said. "He had books, animal husbandry manuals, anything he could get. We were 50 miles from the nearest veterinarian, so we had to manage most things ourselves. He'd been a farmer back in Indiana before he moved us west, and he had the habit of reading everything he could about what he was doing." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "After he died, I spent 2 years reading everything I could find. In Wichita, there's a man named Dr. Cartwell who studies livestock disease. He let me use his library for 3 months, and he would answer my questions when he wasn't busy, which wasn't always, but often enough." She paused. "It bothered him sometimes, I think, that I was learning things he felt he should be charging money to teach. But he was also a fair man and he didn't send me away." "Did you ever think about going to one of the agricultural colleges?" Paul asked. "There's a good one in Kansas." She gave him a look that was dry and knowing, and he caught the drift immediately. "Right," he said quietly. They don't take women. Not for the veterinary course, she said. Not yet, perhaps one day. She said it without bitterness, which cost her something. But bitterness was a luxury that served no purpose when you had to get up tomorrow and work. So I built what I could from what I could reach, and I came to know that what I had was worth something to the ranches that were willing to let me try. A few are enough. Paul was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire. It seems to me, he said carefully, that what you've built from what you could reach is more than most people build from what they were handed. She looked at him, and something warm and unexpected moved through her chest, and she looked away again at the fire because she was not ready to examine it. Tell me about Ohio, she said. He told her. He told her about the farm his father ran, and the particular quiet of those long summers, and why quiet had eventually become oppressive to him. He told her about the cattle drive south, his first, when he was 19 and could barely ride, and had thought the foreman would send him back before the first day was out. And instead the foreman had given him extra duty because he could see Paul would work himself to death before quitting. He told her about the valley, the first time he'd ridden through it on a spring day in 1877 with the red rock blazing and the grass coming green along the creek, and how he had thought, with a certainty he could not explain, here. That's how my father talked about the Kansas land, Celia said. He said he just knew. Did you feel it? About Kansas? She considered this honestly. I felt it about my father's land, she said. Not Kansas particularly. The land is a good land, but it was his more than mine. I understood that even then. I don't know that I've found a piece of land that is mine. She said this calmly, but she was aware in some quiet corner of herself that as she said it she was sitting by a fire in a house on 400 acres backed by a red sandstone ridge, and that she had felt, every morning since she arrived, something that wasn't quite hers and was not quite not hers either. By the end of the first week, 5 of the 6 surviving sick cattle were fully recovered. The 6th still needed monitoring. The water source had been changed. The brass fittings were sitting in a pile outside the barn waiting for the blacksmith to come when the weather allowed, and the rest of the herd was in good health. Dr. Webb arrived on a Saturday, finally through the pass, a weathered man of about 50 who was clearly exhausted from the journey, and who looked at Celia with an expression of professional interest when Paul explained what had happened. Copper toxicity, Webb said, examining the recovery notes she had kept. From brass pipe fittings, I'll be damned, I've only seen that twice before. Good diagnosis, Miss Wallace. He paused and looked at her over the notes. You say you're self-taught. Largely, she said. He handed back the notes. He said nothing else about it, but he looked at her in a way that she thought might be respect, coming from a man who measured it carefully. After Webb left, having confirmed her treatments, made a few additional recommendations, and consumed a considerable quantity of Mrs. Fenwick's coffee, Paul found Celia in the barn doing the evening check. He confirmed everything you did, Paul said. I know, she said, not to be immodest, but because she had been reasonably confident and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Your week is up as of tomorrow, Paul said. I told you a week. She continued checking the recovery animal, not looking at him. It is, she agreed. I want to offer you a longer arrangement, he said. Spring is coming, which means calving season, and that is never without complications. I would pay you fairly for it. We can negotiate terms. You would have your room and a proper wage. Mrs. Fenwick is company. He paused. I am asking because I need someone who knows what you know, not for any other reason. He said the last part with a slight stiffness that told her he was aware of how the offer might sound, and was trying to preemptively address it, which she found unexpectedly endearing. She turned from the animal and looked at him directly. He was standing in the middle of the barn floor with his hat in his hands. He had taken it off, she noticed, which was not something men in barns usually bothered to do, and his expression was the honest, uncomplicated expression she had come to recognize as simply his way of being. I will stay through calving season, she said. We can revisit terms at the end of May. He nodded and put his hat back on, and she turned back to her patient, and neither of them mentioned the fact that they were both smiling. March came in with snow and went out with mud, which was the mountain valley way of doing things, and in between there was calving, which was the work of long cold nights and early cold mornings, and the particular vigilance required by animals who had a tendency to choose the worst possible moment and the worst possible weather for the most important work of their year. Celia was in her element. She had assisted in calving since she was 14, and she was good at it, calm, quick-handed, decisive when decisiveness was needed. She saved 4 calves in March alone that would have been lost without intervention, and one of them she pulled in the middle of a snowstorm while Paul held a lantern, and Jimmy held the mother, and the wind came under the barn door in white ribbons. When it was done and the calf was standing, uncertain and damp and outraged, Paul looked at Celia across its wobbling back and said, with a quiet wonder that he did not try to conceal, "I don't think I've ever seen anything like you work." She was too tired and too cold and too elated about the calf to deflect it properly, so she just said, "Thank you," and let it sit there between them in the lamplight, which felt like more than it was and also exactly like what it was. The thaw came in April and changed everything the way thaws do. The land went from static to alive seemingly overnight, and the color returned to the valley, and the creek ran high with snowmelt, and the cattle moved back out onto the spring grass, and Crimson Bluff Ranch came back to life around them. Paul began teaching Celia to shoot in April, which she had asked him to do because she had noticed several things about the surrounding country that told her being unarmed and it was not wise. He was a patient teacher, and she was a quick learner, and they spent 2 or 3 evenings a week with a pair of rifles behind the barn, shooting at pine cones set along the fence rail, and these sessions were a reliable source of banter because she was as competitive as he was and had told him so directly. "You're pulling left," he said one afternoon, standing slightly behind and to her right. "I am aware," she said tightly. "Try squeezing slower, like you're trying to count to 3 before it fires." She adjusted, fired, and knocked the pine cone clean off the rail. "Better," he said. "Much better," she corrected, and he laughed. She had begun to understand in April that the thing she was trying not to examine was something she was going to have to examine sooner or later. It had taken up too much room to go on being ignored. It was present in the way she noticed when he came into a room, in the way she listened for his boots on the porch in the morning, in the way the conversations they had in the evenings by the fire had begun to feel like something she was building carefully, stone by stone, without knowing quite what the structure would be. He felt it too. She knew this with the practical certainty of a person who is good at observation. It was in the way he had taken to unnecessary reasons to be in whatever room she was in the way he had stopped stiffening slightly when she challenged his judgment on something, and had started looking forward to it, which she could tell because his eyes brightened when she pushed back. In the way he had said her name Celia, not Miss Wallace, since sometime in March with a particular quality of quiet attention, as though the word itself was something he was glad to say. But he was careful. She could see that too. He was a careful man in the way that careful men are when they have something to lose, and she respected the carefulness even as it occasionally frustrated her. It was Mrs. Fenwick who finally made things move, in the way that practical women of a certain type will sometimes intervene in situations that are taking too long for no good reason. She did this at breakfast one morning in late April, in the blunt frontier fashion that brooked no embarrassment. "I'm going to speak plainly, Mrs. Fenwick said, without looking up from her frying pan, "because the two of you have been dancing around each other for 2 months, and I have lived long enough to know that if something useful doesn't happen by summer, you're both going to drive me absolutely out of my mind." Celia looked at her coffee cup. Paul looked at the wall. "That is all I have to say on the subject," Mrs. Fenwick said serenely, and put a plate of eggs in front of each of them. The rest of breakfast passed in a silence that was somehow different from the silence before it, lighter. The way a room is lighter once someone has opened the window, whether or not a breeze has come in yet. That evening, Paul found Celia on the porch. It was the first truly warm evening of spring, the kind where you could sit outside without a coat if you were willing to be slightly cold, and she had chosen to be slightly cold in exchange for the sky, which was doing something extraordinary over the mountains, clouds backlit orange and pink by the sinking sun, the red ridge glowing as though lit from within. "May I sit?" he asked. "You live here," she pointed out, but she moved slightly on the bench to make room, which she wouldn't have done if she hadn't wanted him to. He sat down. They watched the sky do its evening work together. "Celia," he said after a while. "Yes. I want to say something, and I want to say it without it being awkward, but I'm aware that may not be entirely up to me." He turned to look at her. "You are the most capable person I have encountered in 4 years of running this ranch, and that includes everyone I have employed and everyone who has come to help me. You are also the most interesting person I have talked to in a very long time, possibly ever, and I find myself thinking about those conversations and those evenings when you are not in the room, which I did not do about any person before you came." He paused. "I am telling you this because I think you should know where I stand, and not because I expect anything from you or want you to feel any pressure about your situation here. You have a position at this ranch and a wage that is entirely separate from whatever you want to say or not say about this." She was very quiet for a moment. The last of the sun slipped behind the mountain and the sky shifted from orange to a deep and beautiful violet. "Paul," she said. "Yes. When did you last have a conversation with a woman your own age that had nothing to do with needing something done?" He thought about this seriously. "Perhaps 4 years," he said. "When I bought the ranch, I left most of my acquaintances behind. And you chose that." "I chose the ranch," he said. "I was not thinking at the time about what else I was choosing." She looked at him. He was watching her with that attentive, honest expression that she had come to think of as the most reliable thing she had found in the valley. She thought about 3 years of roads and stages and borrowed rooms and the particular cold of sleeping in a place that was not hers. She thought about her father and his land and the way he had known, just known. She thought about mornings in the barn with the light coming through the boards in long stripes and this man beside her holding a lantern while she did the work she knew best. "I am not particularly good at the things that women are usually expected to be good at," she said. "I do not sew well and I lose patience with domestic matters fairly quickly, and I have strong opinions about cattle management that I will not stop having just because someone disagrees." "I know all of these things," Paul said. "They are not complaints. I am also—" She stopped and started again. "I have been alone and moving for 3 years and I am not certain I know how to stop moving. I don't know if there is a piece of land that is mine." She looked at him. "But I know that I have felt every morning since I arrived here as though I am somewhere I was supposed to get to." Something in his face opened like a door. "Celia," he said again quietly, and the name carried everything. "Yes," she said, and it was an answer to multiple questions at once. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on her knee, not dramatically, just the simple fact of his warm hand covering hers in the cooling evening, and they sat on the porch together while the stars came out one by one over the red sandstone ridge, and the ranch settled into its night sounds around them. They were careful, as people of that time and place were careful. The frontier had no patience with scandal, but it had a genuine respect for a straightforward courtship, and theirs was as straightforward as both of them were. Mrs. Fenwick watched all of this with the satisfied expression of a woman who has resolved a problem, and Jimmy and the other hands noticed without comment, as ranch hands generally did about the boss's personal matters. There was one evening in May, a warm evening with the creek running high and the meadow grass already knee-deep, when they walked along the fence line to the north end of the property where the ridge came closest to the valley floor, and Paul showed her the place he had been thinking about for a while, a level shelf of land at the base of the bluff, sheltered from the north wind, with a southern exposure and a natural spring. "What are you thinking about for it?" she asked. I haven't been sure, he said. I've been thinking about expanding the operation. More breeding cattle, possibly. A proper hay barn. He paused. But I wanted to show you before I decided, because you see the land differently than I do. She stood on the shelf and looked south across the valley, the full sweep of the ranch below her, the mountains on both sides, the sky above enormous and blue. You could run another 30 head on the lower pasture if you managed the rotation differently, she said. And this shelf, you're right about the spring. This is good water for cattle in summer when the creek drops. She paused. But if you were going to build anything here, I would build it facing south-southeast. You'd catch the morning sun and be out of the afternoon shadow of the ridge. He was quiet beside her. I was also thinking, he said carefully, about whether this would be a reasonable place to build a second structure, a larger one. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the shelf of land, not at her, but she could see the set of his jaw. Paul, she said, you said you might not know how to stop moving, he said. I'm not asking you to stop moving. I'm asking if you might be willing to stop moving here specifically because I would very much like you to stay. He turned then and looked at her directly. I mean all the way, I mean permanently. The meadow was very bright in the afternoon sun. A hawk was doing something slow and circular over the south pasture. The spring was running thin and cold over the rock shelf beside them. Celia Wallace thought about a stagecoach on a February morning, and a town she had never heard of, and a store owner with a walrus mustache who had pointed her in a direction that had turned out to be the right one. She thought about what it felt like to know things, and to have somewhere that those things were needed and valued, and not merely tolerated. She thought about a man who held lanterns in snowstorms and took his hat off in barns and said her name as though it meant something. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a beat as though checking. Yes, he said. That is what yes means, Paul, she said, and laughed. And he laughed too. And then he stepped forward and took her face in both of his hands, those large, calloused, careful hands, and kissed her. And the hawk wheeled over the south pasture, and the creek ran over the rocks, and the valley held them both in its wide, red-ridged embrace. They were married in June of 1883, in the church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, with Holt and his wife and Mrs. Fenwick, and all 3 ranch hands in attendance, and a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through on the right day, which felt to both of them like a reasonable kind of grace. Celia kept her name professionally. She had built a reputation as Celia Wallace, and she was practical enough to know that the reputation was worth keeping. Socially, she became Mrs. Rhodes, which she found she did not mind at all, perhaps because it had been freely chosen and was not simply a thing that had happened to her. Dr. Webb came back through in August and found her treating a mild case of foot rot in the south herd, and when he asked again about her background, she told him more, and he stood in the yard afterward and said to Paul that his wife was wasted out here in the valley. Paul looked at him with an expression that was perfectly calm and said that he believed she was doing exactly what she chose to do, and that he found it consistently remarkable. Webb went away shaking his head, which both of them found privately amusing. The summer was the best Crimson Bluff Ranch had seen in Paul's 4 years of running it. The calves from the spring season grew well. The herd was healthy. The water situation was resolved by August when the blacksmith came through and replaced every brass fitting on the property with iron ones. And Celia stood watching this with the deep satisfaction of a problem fully solved. She wrote letters to her aunt in Missouri that summer that were different in tone from any she had written before, fuller, more grounded, with the quality of someone writing from a fixed location rather than a temporary one. Her aunt wrote back with something that was almost bewilderment and entirely delight, and said that she had always known Celia would land somewhere worth landing. In October, when the first real cold of the new season came down from the mountains, and the ranch settled into its winter preparations, Celia told Paul one evening by the fire that she was fairly certain she was expecting a child. He was very still for a moment, and then he reached over and took her hand and said, "Are you all right?" "I am entirely all right," she said. "I am actually quite pleased." He brought her hand up and pressed it against his cheek for a moment, and she could feel him smiling. "Good," he said, "good." Their son was born in June of 1884, healthy and loud, with Paul's coloring and Celia's eyes, and an immediately apparent opinion about everything, which Mrs. Fenwick said was exactly what she would have predicted from these two particular parents. They named him Thomas James Rhodes, after both their fathers, and he came into the world in the bedroom of the ranch house during a summer thunderstorm that lit the mountains blue and white while the creek ran full below. Celia was back in the barn within a week, because there were cattle that needed checking, and because she was constitutionally incapable of not being useful, and because Mrs. Fenwick was perfectly capable of managing a newborn for a few hours and said so firmly. Paul went with her, not to supervise but because he always came when she was working, and they checked the herd together in the morning light while their son slept in the house. There was an afternoon in late summer when Paul came to find her in the barn and leaned against the stall doorframe and said, "Webb's partner in Durango has taken ill. Webb wrote to ask if you would consider coming in as a consultant for the practice. He'd pay for your expertise on cattle cases, the ones he doesn't have time to travel to personally." Celia sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "A consulting arrangement. That's what he proposed. You'd stay here, this would be your base. He'd send cases that are close enough that you could make the trip in a day, or come back the same day." He said. Paul paused, and she could see him choosing his words carefully. "He said he'd been thinking about it since August and that you'd be doing work most trained veterinarians couldn't do as well, and that he thought that deserved to be formalized." She was quiet for a moment. "It's not a degree," she said. "No," Paul agreed. "It's not. But it's a professional arrangement with a respected veterinarian that would give your work a standing it doesn't currently have." She thought about this. She thought about what it would mean, the recognition, the legitimacy, the small but real shift in how the ranchers of the area would view what she did. She thought about her father's almanacs and Dr. Cartwell's library and 3 years of Rhodes and all of it building towards something, and this being more of that something. "Tell Webb I'd like to discuss terms," she said. Paul smiled. "I already told him you'd say exactly that." She threw a handful of clean hay at him, which made him laugh, and the cattle regarded this spectacle with the placid indifference of cattle everywhere. The consulting arrangement with Dr. Webb began that autumn and was, as Paul had predicted, both professionally legitimate and genuinely useful. Celia rode out once or twice a week to neighboring ranches on cases Webb referred, and she built a reputation across the county that was specific and solid. She was not trying to be everything to everyone. She was very particular about livestock medicine, and in that narrow but essential specialty, she was known as the person to send for. Some ranchers still raised their eyebrows at first, in the way of men who have been slow to revise their assumptions, and then their cattle got better and the eyebrows came down. The winter of 1884 was hard but manageable, and the spring of 1885 brought another calving season and another batch of difficult nights, and Celia and Paul worked through all of it together with the easy, deep cooperation of two people who have learned each other's rhythms. On a March evening in 1885, with Thomas nearly a year old and pulling himself upright on the furniture with the intense concentration of someone who has decided walking is the next project, Celia sat at the kitchen table with her medical notes, and her almanac, and Paul sat across from her reading a letter from his brother in Ohio, and Mrs. Fenwick was knitting by the fire, and outside the late winter wind was doing its business against the windows, and the house held all of them in its warm interior, and the red sandstone ridge stood dark behind it, and the stars were coming out over the valley. Paul looked up from his letter and across the table to his wife, who was annotating a treatment record with the same focused attention she brought to everything, her dark hair pinned loose at the back of her neck, her pen moving in quick decisive strokes, And he thought about a February morning when a stagecoach had come into Harrow Flats with a woman on it who knew what was wrong with his cattle before she had been on the property for 5 minutes. "Celia," he said. She looked up. "Nothing," he said. "I just like knowing you're there." She looked at him for a moment with those steady dark eyes, and then she went back to her notes, but she was smiling, and he saw it. Thomas learned to walk in April, and immediately applied this skill to investigating the barn, which required Celia to institute what she called the barn protocol: the lower half of the barn door latched always. Always, always. A rule that all 3 ranch hands followed without complaint, because they were already half in love with Thomas's mother in the uncomplicated, affectionate way of young men who are grateful to the person who keeps the cattle alive. Jimmy, the youngest hand, left in early summer of 1885 to take up his own small homestead claim 30 miles north, which was the natural and proper way of things on the frontier. Paul hired 2 new hands, and Celia assessed them both in the direct manner she had developed for this purpose. She asked them about cattle medicine, and if they knew nothing, she taught them the basics, and if they were willing to learn, they were worth keeping. That summer, Celia discovered she was expecting again and told Paul on the porch in the evening, the same porch where everything had started to become what it became, and his reaction was the same as the first time: the stillness and the hand and the smile pressed against her fingers. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Remarkably all right," she said. "Good," he said. "Good." Their second child came in the early spring of 1886, a girl this time, who arrived considerably faster and with considerably less ceremony than Thomas had, and who was born, Mrs. Fenwick reported with great satisfaction, with an expression of someone who already had opinions. They named her Sarah Margaret Rhodes, after nobody in particular but with names that fit her, which seemed to Celia the best reason for a name. Sarah had Celia's coloring and Paul's temperament: patient, observant, and then very suddenly decisive. And from the earliest age she had a way of watching the cattle in the pasture with a focused attention that made her parents exchange meaningful glances. "She is going to be trouble," Mrs. Fenwick said comfortably, watching 4-month-old Sarah track a cow across the yard with her eyes. "She is going to be fine," Celia said, which was both a correction and a prediction. The summer of 1886 was dry, and with drought came the particular challenges of a water-scarce season. The creek dropped, the lower pastures went to dust earlier than usual, and the cattle had to be managed carefully to prevent the kind of accumulated stress that opened the door to illness. Celia rotated the herd with meticulous attention, moved the most vulnerable animals to the spring pasture at the north end, the shelf below the bluff, which Paul had developed with a proper trough from the natural spring, and got through the summer with the herd intact. There was one August afternoon when she came back from a consulting call at a ranch 12 miles south, and found Paul and Thomas. Thomas was 2 now, solemn and sturdy, sitting on the fence rail of the corral, Thomas on Paul's knee, both of them looking at the horses with the same expression. She stopped the horse she was riding and watched them for a moment, and the specific character of the feeling this gave her was something she thought about later: not softness exactly, but something deeper and more solid than softness. Fullness, maybe. The sense of all the empty spaces filled. Paul turned as she rode into the yard, and his face did the thing it did, the opening up thing, and Thomas said "Mama" with the deep satisfaction of a child reporting an important fact. "Hello, you two," she said, dismounting. "How was the Garrity ranch?" Paul asked. "Bloat," she said. "Nothing complicated. They'd been trying to graze them on the new alfalfa too fast." I showed them the rotation schedule and left them with some guidance on the transition timing. "They'll listen. Mr. Garrity will listen," she said. His wife already knew. She handed the reins to the hand who came forward to take the horse. "Did Thomas eat?" "Twice," Paul said. "He's a very serious eater." Thomas regarded this assessment with equanimity. By the end of 1886, Celia had built her consulting practice to a point where she was the first call for 7 ranches in the county, which was more than enough to keep her fully occupied between the demands of her own herd. She had also begun, somewhat to her own surprise, to keep a written record of her treatments and outcomes. A detailed technical log that was less a diary than a medical record book, and which Dr. Webb had looked at during one of his occasional visits, and said, with the measured approbation of a man who did not give it easily, that this was the kind of documentation that one day would be taught in agricultural colleges. She had looked at him steadily when he said this and said, "Then I hope someone teaches it." "It should be you," he said. "Perhaps," she said. She did not know yet if this was possible, but she kept writing. She had always kept writing. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was one of the worst in memory for the high plains and mountains of Colorado, the Big Die-Up. It was called in the papers, when cattle across the region froze and starved in numbers that destroyed some operations entirely. Celia had seen the signs of it coming in autumn. The fat reserves the cattle were building, the early migration of the deer, the particular quality of the October cold, and she had spent September and October preparing obsessively. Extra hay, extra feed, the cattle brought close, the spring shelter at the north end fully stocked, the water sources checked and rechecked. Crimson Bluff Ranch lost 2 animals in the worst of the January freeze, which was too many, but was also a fraction of what their neighbors lost. The Hendrickson operation 12 miles west lost 40 head. The McAllister brothers lost nearly half their herd. Ranches that had been running for a decade were finished. In the worst weeks of it, Celia rode out in conditions that made Paul quiet with something that was not quite fear, but adjacent to it. He had seen her competence in enough situations by now to trust it, but that did not entirely suppress the instinct of a man who watches the woman he loves riding into a blizzard. She always came back, frozen to the eyebrows and satisfied, and full of specific observations about what she had found and what she had done. And he always had hot coffee ready, and the kind of restraint that knew she would not want to be fussed over. One night in February, the coldest night of that terrible winter, she came in from 3 hours in the barn where she had been sitting with a struggling calf and found him up at midnight by the kitchen fire, and she sat down across from him and took the coffee and said, "The calf is going to make it." "Good," he said. "Are you all right?" She asked because she could read him as well as she read the cattle, and the something around his eyes was not nothing. "I am always all right when you come back in," he said simply. She looked at him across the fire. "Paul," she said. "Yes, I'm not going anywhere." "I know," he said. He stopped. "You just like knowing I'm there," she said, and gave his own words back to him with the quiet precision she brought to everything. He exhaled and reached across the small table, and she took his hand. The spring of 1887 was a resurrection. After the devastation of that winter, everything that had survived had a particular value, and the ranches that had made it through began the slow work of rebuilding. Celia spent most of April and May riding through the county, helping neighboring operations assess what they had and what they could do with it, keeping track of which animals were best positioned for breeding, and which herds needed supplemental nutrition to recover from the winter stress. It was the most demanding work she had ever done, and also, in some ways, the most satisfying. The scale of it, the clear and immediate usefulness of it. Paul ran the home ranch through all of this with the steady competence she had long taken slightly for granted, and then remembered in moments of honest reflection not to take for granted. He managed the hands, he managed the logistics, he managed Thomas and Sarah with Mrs. Fenwick, and he never once in all of that spring gave her anything but support. Not even the particular kind of silent martyrdom that she had seen in other husbands of women who worked, the expression that said, "Look what I am enduring." There was none of it. He was proud of her, and he showed it in the practical way of someone who understands that the best support is the kind that makes it possible for the other person to do what they need to do. She told him this one evening directly, because she had been thinking it for a while, and she was not a person who left useful truths unsaid. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am aware of what you do here, all of it. The fact that you never make me feel as though my work is a problem for you, I know that is not nothing. I know what it costs, and I know it is a choice." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was touched and also slightly amused. "Celia," he said. "Yes." "You saved my herd," he said. "You came in off a February stage with no money and a satchel, and you saved my herd, and then you saved it again during the worst winter on record. The very least I can do is be a man you don't have to fight against." She was quiet for a beat. "It should not be a remarkable quality," she said. "No," he agreed. "It shouldn't." She moved across the room to where he was sitting by the window, watching the evening come over the valley, and she sat beside him and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they looked out at the red ridge turning the color of a live coal in the last of the sun. Thomas was 3 in June of 1887 and had developed a serious interest in the horses, which Paul encouraged with the enthusiasm of a man who had waited his whole life to teach someone to ride. Sarah, at 14 months, was walking with great confidence and had already figured out that the barn was the most interesting place on the property, a discovery that had been, as predicted, considerable trouble. In the autumn of 1887, a letter arrived from an agricultural newspaper in Denver requesting that Celia contribute an article on cattle disease prevention for the winter issue. Dr. Webb had apparently recommended her. She sat with the letter for a long time, reading it over twice, and then she put it on the kitchen table and went out to the barn and stood there for a while with the smell of hay and cattle around her, thinking. Paul found her there and read the letter she'd left on the table and came out to find her. "Are you going to write it?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I am going to write it." She wrote it at the kitchen table over 3 evenings in October, and she wrote it clearly and directly, the same way she did everything, and Paul read the draft and said it was the best thing he had read in years, which was not something he said lightly. Mrs. Fenwick read it and said it was very informative, which was her version of the same thing. It was published in December of 1887 under the name Celia Wallace Rhodes, because she had decided to use both, the name she had built and the name she had chosen, and both of them belonged to her. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was mild by comparison to the previous year, and they were grateful for it in the bone-deep way of people who had survived the alternative. Christmas was quiet and good. Mrs. Fenwick made a spectacular amount of food. Thomas received his first pony saddle, which he regarded with holy reverence, and Sarah received a set of small carved animals that she lined up along the windowsill in a configuration that seemed, to Celia's eye, suspiciously like a proper herding arrangement. "She is going to be you," Paul said quietly, watching their daughter assess her carved cattle. "God help her," Celia said, and did not mean it even slightly. Spring came again, the way it always came, tentative at first and then all at once, the snow pulling back up the mountains, the valley going green, the creek rising, and Celia stood on the porch on a morning in late March of 1888 and looked out over the ranch and thought about a February 5 years ago when she had stepped off a stagecoach with $3.42 and a name. She had come with nothing but her name and what she knew. She still had her name. What she knew had grown into something larger and more useful than she had fully understood when she was carrying it across the cold country in a worn satchel. The ranch was theirs fully, properly, without debt for the first time since Paul had taken it on. The herd was healthy and larger than it had been, running 140 head now, and each one of them was known to her in the way that cattle are known to a person who has spent years studying and caring for them. The range was in good condition. The spring shelter at the bluff was an essential and established part of the operation. The consulting practice had a solid reputation that stretched well beyond the immediate county. She heard Paul's boots behind her on the porch boards, and then his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back slightly against him. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "That first morning," she said, "coming in on the stage. What about it?" "I was thinking about how cold I was," she said, "and how certain I was that I didn't know where I was going to sleep that night." She paused, "and how it turned out to be here." He rested his chin on the top of her head, and they looked out at the valley together, the creek running silver through the green grass, the cattle moving slowly in the south pasture, the red ridge blazing behind the house in the morning sun. "I'm glad it was here," he said. "So am I," she said. "Every day." Thomas came bursting through the front door with a piece of rope and a determined expression, announcing that he was going to practice his roping, which at age 3½ consisted primarily of roping the fence posts and occasionally the dog. Paul detached himself from Celia to intercept his son with the patient calm that had become the defining feature of his fathering, redirecting the rope-related ambitions towards something less likely to cause trouble. Celia watched them, her husband and her son, in the spring yard, the rope making wide loops in the morning air, Thomas very serious about it, and she felt the fullness of it again, that specific deep-filled quality, and she let it be exactly what it was. Later that morning she went into the barn and checked the south herd, and noted that 2 of the pregnant cows were showing the early signs that meant calving within the week, and she made notes in her log and began preparing for it. The work was there, and she was glad for it, and it was hers. The work and the land and the family and the long future stretching out ahead of her in this valley. She had arrived in on a cold February morning with nothing but her name. She had come with her name and what she knew had saved his herd, and the herd had led her here, to this particular life, which had turned out to be the one she had been building toward all along without knowing its shape. She closed the log and hung her lantern and walked out of the barn into the morning sun, and Paul was coming across the yard toward her with Thomas on his shoulders, and the easy long stride she would have known anywhere. And the valley was green around them, and the ridge was red and high, and the sky was open and enormous and blue in the way of spring skies in the Colorado mountains, and everything that had been uncertain was certain now, and everything that had been lost had, in its way, been found. She walked toward him, and he reached out a hand to her as she came near, and she took it, and they stood together in the yard of Crimson Bluff Ranch in the spring of 1888 with their son on Paul's shoulders, reaching for the sky, and their daughter's voice coming through the open window of the house, and Mrs. Fenwick's shout about breakfast. And all of it was theirs, and all of it was good, and all of it was enough, and more than enough, and exactly right.